All righty. Welcome to the webinar, everybody. Welcome, Dustin. Dustin Valkelma back. Am I saying your name right, Valkelma? I feel like I should know by now. I'm just double checking.
It works. It works. It's Volkema, Volkema. But
Valkelma. I was wrong.
Valkema, Valkema, Val Kilmer. It's all I've
Val
been
Kilmer. Oh my gosh. Dustin Val Kilmer. You know
run the
Dustin Val
gamut.
Kilmer? I love that. So yeah, what's up, buddy? How you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, happy Monday, everyone. Once again, it's I feel like Mondays are a day that I look forward to. So it's great to be here.
These have been really fun. Yeah, I'm definitely super stoked on this one. I decided in the spirit of like Halloween, because I just got back from Camp Mograph really late last night. I decided to be festive and show up as a zombie. So in the spirit of Halloween, that was a joke.
Yeah, it works. A few more weeks, but we'll get there.
Camp Mograph is amazing, by the way. If any of you are interested in Mography business, Camp Mograph is great. You also get a zombie costume when you go there, but it's so worth it. It's so fantastic. Okay, let's just jump in. Am I sharing my screen? Am I wearing pants? Am I doing all the things? I always feel like so discombobulated when I start these things because I'm just so excited to get into it that I lose track of stuff. So stop me if something looks dumb or is dumb.
I need access to the Q&A.
Oh
We'll
yeah,
start there. But
booey.
yes, we can see your screen.
Wait, here we go. Here we go. I figured it out last time. So yes. Okay, there we go. All right.
I can
So
see all of you now.
housekeeping business. You got it?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, cool. So the housekeeping business really quick. Last week I blew it on the free t-shirt thing in the handout section of GoToWebinar, or if you're using a mobile device, there's like a little like document icon. So you click that and that has a PDF that has a link and you need that special link. And when you click on the link, you will go to a special store for these webinars and you'll be asked for a passcode. So that's how you know if you did it right. If you're just in like the regular like Maxon gift shop or whatever, like this is not going to work and doesn't apply at all. So you have to have the magic link. And then in this area, you have to type the passcode, which is digital cinematography. All one word, all caps, no spaces, digital cinematography. And then actually I'll just do it. I'll demonstrate it right here. Digital cinematography. And then I'll click continue. Then you get access to the magic shirt. And then when you go to checkout, all you have to do is pay for shipping. And then you get a free t-shirt. So thanks for joining us. Also, a reminder, go to the maxon.net website, check out the new features from last week. And then you go to news, events, see all the amazing webinars that we're doing. There's Camp Mograph, there's like what we're doing right now. And then Ask the Trainer, VFX and Chill, all the different shows coming up. And then also this session is being recorded. It's going to be at our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Maxon Training Team. And so shortly after we're done recording these, they will be posted here with links so you can jump to it. Thank you, Dr. Sassy, for doing that. And that's that. So that's all the housekeeping business, I think. Stop me if I'm wrong, but I'm just going to keep going as if I did it right. Today we're going to be talking about the aperture. We're going to be digging deeper into the aperture. And just as a very quick recap of what we've covered this month, we're at the halfway point where we have 2 sessions behind us, this session and next week ahead of us. So just as a brief recap, so in case you feel like a little bit behind, like you haven't seen one of those sessions and you want to kind of catch up, we talked the first week about the basics of exposure, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and how we could use these 3 things to adjust our exposure, but also, when you deal with the devil, the other side of that where you also have these trade-offs where you have these other things that are affected by adjusting the aperture in one of these ways. Or another way to look at it is that you could also use these same tools, the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, to regulate noise, to control blur, to control the sharpness and crispness of the movement of images. So that's another way to look at a positive spin, if you will. And we talked about diffusing light and the hard light versus soft light. And we talked about different angles of light and the placement of light and the impact of putting lights in different places, as well as techniques for how to light things. And all of it is in service to try to create a beautiful shot, which we will get to next week. So we're building all these things. And next week, we'll look at this example again of how we took this shot that's very unflattering and with no money and no budget, just created something much more elegant in the same space and everything. So we're going to pick up where I messed up last week. Thank you for your patience. I felt so horrible when I was doing last week. My brain was just like not working at all. And so we didn't get to talk about fog. I want to talk about fog really quick, and then we're going to be talking about the aperture. We're going to be digging deep into the aperture, and there's so much you can do with it to control the depth of field, to control bokeh, and there's just a lot of power when you really learn the aperture. So we're going to be digging deep into how the aperture is calculated, f-stops, some technical stuff, and also some really great stuff. And we're going to be going into After Effects cameras and Cinema 4D cameras and Particular and all over the place. It's going to be really fun. So just really quick, when we have, let's see, I'm going to get my notes like all set up here so I'm in the right spot. Okay, yeah. So we use fog for a few reasons. Number one, it's just like gorgeous. It reminds me of Scooby-Doo, and I love Scooby-Doo. So there's a lot of different reasons why we might use fog. And by the way, when I was at Catmograph, it was in Virginia, they had like low-lying fog, which I don't think that I've ever experienced like to that extent. And it was so Scooby-Doo. It was amazing. It was just like actual like wisps hanging along the ground that were like thick wisps. It was nuts and very like swampy and Scooby-Doo-ish, and it was very cool. And so it made me excited about this morning to talk about fog. So oftentimes, like when we're on set, we have fog machines because they're like $20 or something like that. I mean, cheap ones like $20, and I think that's like how much I spent on the one used in this shot. It was just $20 fog machine, really cheap, inexpensive. You flood it with fog. Oftentimes, like you have somebody called a fog wrangler. Well, I call a fog wrangler, who just takes it like a flag that you use for lighting and just kind of wafts it around and diffuses the fog so it just kind of spreads everywhere. And that does a few things for you that's really interesting. And you might be saying like, I work in Redshift, I don't want to get a fog machine, and that's totally cool. But this is applicable. So fog does a few things. Number one, it increases the exposure. So you often see it in the movies in night scenes for a lot of reasons, but one of them is absolutely utilitarian, because if you've ever tried to shoot anything at night, it is really tough to get a good exposure when the world is pitch black and all the light, you have to add yourself to the scene. And the light that we need to see as human beings is like very tiny, but cameras have a tough time illuminating the scene because they don't have typically the dynamic range that our eyes have. So as you shoot fog into the scene, it creates stuff to scatter the light and bounce it around and diffuse those light rays and spread them out. So then if I shoot a light into a scene like this, it can illuminate the whole world and give you like daytime level exposures at night. So one of the purposes is utilitarian. Another purpose is that it allows us to create depth. So here's a shot from a movie I did, and you can't really have a great sense of the depth of the scene, but once the fog comes in here, you could see that like we now have a better sense of kind of like the world space. We could tell like what's close to us and what's not. And so it gives us a greater sense of the depth of the scene, which at night is like really impossible because it's like pitch black going back forever. So fog allows us to kind of get a frame of reference here. So here's like The Last Emperor, another scene that was like really deep, like a really far scene, like the world was really big. And fog kind of gives us this sense that like we're in this, huge place. And you can see the fog swirling over here. It really does create a great ambient effect. And that's another reason why people use it, is to create a sense of just atmosphere, just a world. And also it's so interesting talking about the exposure. I mean, look at this scene. I mean, these leaves, the backside of these leaves are really dark, but over here, I mean, this is as bright as like any scene. This is like really bright because of the fog. So you see Spielberg using this stuff all the time, which is it's like a trademark thing. Anyways, another thing that you can do with light, or with fog, with lights, is to create volumetric light. So when you put fog into the scene and you light it, it illuminates light rays. And then you could do stuff with those light rays and use those as an artistic device. So like you heard God rays, it's because there's clouds and, it creates these streaks. So you've never seen God rays on a sunny day, a clear sunny day, because there's nothing to diffuse the light to make the light visible. So like it's used a lot in like horror movies, like here in Insidious, and in this shoot we did with our model Bitsy here, we had her just sit in front of a light and we had fog in the scene, and it creates, I mean, she was just like playing around, but like look at the art that she's making with her body because of the fog and the light rays, and she like puts her hands up and look at that. I don't know, I just think that's like really amazing. And you could do some really, we told her just to play, we told her to do like a Superman pose, superhero pose, and like even just like when she sticks her fingers out, like I love that, like you could see the light rays going around her fingers because it's volumetric. You can see the volume of the light. And one of the cool ways, so anyways, let's back up. This is a really cool thing. Knowing all these things, you can use these same tools, using fog to create atmosphere, to enhance your exposure, to create these like amazing artistic projections of light, God rays, if you will, or whatever. Or what's it called? Crepuscular light. I think that's like the official, like the sciencey word for it. And then you could do all this stuff in Redshift. You could render this way. And Dustin, I'm going to turn over to you. Do you have an example you could show us of like how to set this up? It's like, it's not like you would think where you would just say like, all right, just make volume in this scene. And like, Cinema 4D standard lights have like this like, volumetric drop down. You could say like, all right, make this light volumetric. And that's really cool and really helpful and very, very simple, which is amazing. And it's definitely more complex in Redshift, but in Redshift, it works in a similar way, because when you have volumetric light, like in the standard Cinema 4D lights, the volume of the light and seeing the light rays is not really a function of the light. It's really a function of the environment. It's really a function of having fog in the world. And so I think that having this as a base, understanding the fog and what that's doing to the light rays, helps us understand Redshift a little bit more. And so Dustin's going to
Yeah, well, we're going to do a very quick. I know, Chad, that you have quite a bit to get through today. So we're going to do a very quick kind of rundown of a couple different ways that I like to use the Redshift lights and volume, and we'll save a lot of the technicalities for a later session because I know we can deep dive that all on its own.
Sweet.
All right, can you see my screen?
I cannot. Oh, yep.
Okay, I'm going to hide my video here a moment so we can make this a little bit larger. All right, so Redshift volume. It's pretty easy now. In earlier versions of Redshift, the settings were kind of maxed out. It made it really difficult to work with. So we have a very simple scene. You can see that I have a point light here that is emitting light behind the ball. Now, I don't generally use a point light, but I wanted to bring a point light in to show you why I would use it in certain scenarios. So right now, as Chad said, we have a dark scene. It's quite stark with just one light source. The point light doesn't really have a visible light source. So I like to use this when I'm doing things like maybe illuminating an LED or something of that nature. And I don't need to have any visible light coming from it. So what we're going to do now is simply bring in a Redshift environment. Boom, and then we have scattering. That's quite amazing. So this has done exactly what Chad was just talking about in adding a layer of diffusion throughout the scene. So it's allowing it to scatter light all over the place. So this looks like what could be a Z-depth pass currently, and we want to tone this down quite a bit. So the easiest way to do that is to drop our scattering and allow less light to be scattered. And so now we can see that we still have these effects. So with the point light, as I said, it's just a singular, literally a point imagine like a vertex in space or a null object that's emitting light. Now, what I like to do with these is actually use textures inside of the point light. So if I select that, and we can head to textures here, and we'll find something like maybe abstract, and then we can grab a random texture and pull this into the color, into the texture slot for our point light. Give it a moment, and there we go. Now we can see that we've plugged in a gobo to the point light, and this is giving us that God ray look and effect. So it gives us quite a bit of information. So the other way that I like to use these is with the area light. Let's do the window light first. There we go. All right, so now we have a window light in the environment, and our scattering is really low. And so if we go ahead and bring this up, there we go, we can start to see the rays coming across. Let's maybe set it back to 0.1 at default. And now we can see the scattering that's coming from our light source here. And so the cool thing about the area lights themselves is that when you have something like a gobo plugged into it, there's actually multiple ways that you can adjust this. So first of all, we'll head to our window light, and we can increase the intensity quite a bit. And now down at the bottom, we have our spread. So with gobos, I generally like to keep my spread at 0. You can easily start to feather those off a little bit by adjusting that. And now we can see that we're still getting our God rays, or that same effect, but we've now diffused that light or that gobo, so it's not really cutting through so nicely. It's not as pretty as it was before. So we can head back to 0, and let's turn on, let's see, window example. We can turn on the triangle. Now, these are all just lights that are in our scene, and we've placed a redshift environment in, kept it pretty standard to its its original settings, and have just adjusted a little bit back and forth with the scattering that we have here.
Hey,
So
Dustin.
yeah.
Just real quick, that's super gorgeous. Just want to point that out.
Thanks.
So, sorry,
Thanks.
okay.
Yeah, so I like to use spotlights. I like to use spotlights quite a bit for things like laser shows, or mimicking that same type of effect. So these are just gobo textures that we're plugging into the lights texture slot, and then we can adjust the color from there. And so with this one, it's quite easy. I just have a triangle texture. Let me see if I can find this here. I believe it's this one here. So these are a bunch of textures that I'm building. We'll have these available. We'll talk about this in a whole nother stream at some point. Just know that those will be available at some point. But we have a lot of these gobos that are creating various effects. So essentially all a gobo is just a black and white texture. You can go ahead and check out like photography gobos on Google. Take a look. Any of those type of textures are going to work. Imagine it being just a stencil for your light to travel through. Now, what I do want to talk about quickly is that, we've already discussed, hey, let's plug a texture into our light. We have to have the redshift environment turned on. That's going to give us the volumetrics, and we can adjust it at its base attributes with the scattering intensity. Now, if we turn on a couple of these lights here, there we go, and we can even turn on the maybe not that one. That one's a little bit crazy. Let's do the point light. Okay, so right now this point light is super bright compared to the others, and maybe I need it this bright to be affecting the ball the way that I want it to in my scene. I can turn off the window light here a moment so we're not getting extra crazy. Now, the other place that we can adjust these, all right, we've talked about the redshift environment to control the scattering. We've talked about the light intensity a bit, and using gobos to control more art directed, pretty God rays and volumetric light looking light coming through them. But the other place that we can do this is in the details tab of our light. So if we scroll down, we have a volume slider here, and this is going to be the volume contribution. So if I turn this all the way to 0, we'll see that now our point light goes away from the volumetrics, but it's still kind of shedding that nice gobo texture across our scene. So it's a really cool way that we can art direct using that. And if we want to have that kind of volumetric look for it, we can just go ahead and start turning this up. And now we can mix between what is contributing to the volumetrics in our scene and what is simply giving us lighting effects or having just light contribution by itself. So yeah, in a nutshell, a very quick explanation of how to go through this. That's about it. Volumetrics are done through the Redshift environment using various lights. Place some kind of gobo texture in the light to create some really nice God rays, and then use contribution to start mixing what is volumetric and what's not in your scene.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, dude. It's really interesting as you're going through this. It's like I'm thinking more too, because like part of this, whole month obviously is like comparing and contrasting real world cinematography with digital cinematography, and there's good and bad things about that, and the ability to control a light in the scene and how much it contributes to the volume or how much environment hits that light is obviously something you can't do on set. If you have two lights and it's foggy, you can't say, you know what, this light, I want it to not be affected by the fog. You can't do that. Like, it's just, if you have an environment, it's just everything's affected. So you have so much more control in Redshift. And also, it's one of the things that's interesting too, is that, if this were on set, the triangle and the gobo shadow, those like lights on the ground would be intersecting and messing with each other, and it would be really hard to be able to get both textures to show up on screen. They would bleed over each other, kind of like the add blend mode. You have like light adding on light, it would all just be a big pile of white and not be distinct textures. But you can,
Right.
through controlling it, have both those textures too. And the other side of the coin is that if you want to make it look realistic, you actually have to figure out how to blend the light that's hitting the ground in a way so that it looks like actually two sources of light. Because if you have like a red light and a green light landing on the ground, it's not going to be like red and green circles overlapping. It's going to be just like white, like as they're blending, their light together, like, or it's going to be
Right.
yellow or whatever, but like it's going to be brighter because it's two light sources combining forces. So man, this is
Definitely.
gorgeous. I feel like I'm bringing great dishonor to the Demystifying series to take the screen back from you. What's really interesting is that like we talked about the differences between like still photography and and cinematography. And gobo is one of those things. Like, I don't think I've heard the term gobo on a film set. We use the term cookie. We call them cookies. So if you ever
Yeah.
hear that term, it's short for cookie loris. So like I always wondered, like, what's the story behind cookies? Like, somebody hold up a cookie to the light, and like, no, it actually is short for cookie loris, and they abbreviate it as cookie. So like, oh, get a cookie, just put a cookie on it. Film set. That's love our terminology. All right, let's quickly talk about lens flares, and I want to make sure we have time for some like bokeh depth of field stuff, but I just want to get into lens flares really quickly, because lens flares are a way for you to kind of again play with real world cameras. And I think, again, this is one of those things where if you understand the way that a real camera works, then as you're trying to do digital stuff, like even if you never ever want to play with real world cameras, understanding how lens flares work in real life can help you be a better compositor, or if you're going to add a lens flare, help you do that in a more tactful and truthful way. So actually, the best way to explain this is with the Red Giant plugin, Real Lens Flares in the VFX suite, and because it actually is a simulation of real lens flares. Like, they're not creating a bunch of like sprites and images. Like, this is actually how a lens flare would work. So if I go to light source and I move the 2D position of my light, you could see that these lens elements are moving and evolving. They're not like, so if I put this, let's say, centered, So you can see that they're called squids, these little like things. It's like, and there's an actual name for them. The squids like change shape and form just like they would with a real camera lens. It's not just like these are just kind of like a static image and then, you know, they just kind of rotate the static image. It's not like that. They are changing shape as the lens changes direction, or the source of light changes direction. And to get even deeper into this, I'm going to click the designer, open the designer for the real lens flares. And to give you an idea of how nerdy this gets, you can actually select, go into lens simulations, and it's kind of like a preset browser where there are presets for like actual lenses that we use in real life, the Canon 28 to 70, for example. And this is at 28 millimeter. This is exactly what that flare would look like. They profiled the lens, all the components of the lens, and here you have the lens. And so it's a great way to learn about, you know, lens flares as well as cinematography. So this represents the sensor on the right, the camera sensor. And then over here, this is the like the light source. And so as we have the light go through the light source, it goes through all these different lens components. And so we get, you know, this lens flare, and this is like what these flares would create. And we're getting all of these little details, all of these like nooks and crannies because of these lens components. So actually, we haven't talked about this, but we have two types of lenses typically. We have what are called zoom lenses. Let's start with zoom lenses, where like you can adjust the lens itself. There's like a little like rotation thingy on it, and you could like tweak it and go around in circles, and then that changes the zoom. So you could like go be like zoomed out and then like zoom in by using the zoom lens. There's also a type of lens called primes, which cannot zoom. They have one focal length and they can't zoom in and out. And when people are first starting cinematography, I've seen this a lot where they're kind of like, why would you ever want that? That's dumb. Obviously, I'm going to get a zoom lens so I could just like have all these different zooms. But prime lenses, like on if you're on a film set, it's like very, very rare to use zoom lenses from my experience. Like not very rare. Like it's not like this like, whoa, that's crazy. But it's much, much more common to use prime lenses because the optical quality of primes is usually far superior to that of zoom lenses. It's much better, and they're usually much faster, meaning that they can the aperture can open much wider on a prime lens than it can on a zoom lens. So they're pretty popular in that respect. But if you are going for lens flares, you get all of these little doohickeys that are here. That's not an official term, by the way, but all these little like things going on because of all of these different lens elements. So if you have, you'll notice here in the lens simulations, these are all zoom lens, or most of them are zoom lenses, because if you have, you know, a prime lens, you have much simpler components, and so your lens flares are much less busy and complex, and so you have just these kind of like much fewer components. So that's one way. If you're on set and you want to get more lens flares, then you want to make sure the light source is visible in the scene, and like that the camera is like kind of pointing at the light source, and also use zoom lenses. Another thing is that these lens elements now, because they kind of saw lens flares, you know, like historically lens flares have been like a negative thing. Like we want to get rid of lens flares. So these lenses all have anti-reflective coating. And actually, if you select a lens element here, like a piece of glass in the lens, and then you go over here to the right, you could actually adjust the front anti-reflective coating, the anti-reflective thickness, the rear anti-reflective coating. You could play with all of that stuff and adjust that for like every piece of glass in the lens, which is like really incredible. And we really want to make this like just a really great simulation of lenses. But anti-reflective coating hasn't always existed. So if you want to shoot like real world lens flares, and I actually have some examples of this, but because I was at Camp Bogre, I didn't have time to dig through my archives and get them, but maybe next week. But if you use vintage lenses, like old school lenses, sometimes they need an adapter in order to work. They won't have this anti-reflective coating. So if you use like an antique or like an older like 1970s-ish zoom lens, it won't have the anti-reflective coating. It will have all those components of the zoom lens, and you can create your own lens flares that are complicated and really beautiful and have all these kind of like cool details. Now, if I just select the light sensor source or the lens itself, I'll also get the aperture. And what's amazing is, let me see if I can't get this into a better spot. This is actually the way that lenses work, where if I had this shot in my scene and I had this flare in my scene, I'm using this like Leica 16 to 35, and I got all these things. Can I make this bigger? Make this bigger. No, can't make it bigger. But if I stop down, in other words, if I close the aperture, you're going to see that reflected in all of these components. And so if I see here, my f-stop is f4. If I stop down, in other words, I'm decreasing the size of the aperture. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. You could see that we are making these lens components all smaller, because that's exactly what would happen. And it's also changing the way that the squid looks. It's changing the shape of the squid because we are closing down the aperture. And likewise, again, if we open up the aperture, we're going to make each of those components bigger. So, you might think like, well, how could I scale down these elements or whatever? And there isn't a way to like adjust them, because this is like a simulation of real world lenses. And so everything just kind of works the way that it would in a real lens, where these components are reacting and behaving like they would with a real lens and a lens flare. So that's very cool. Another thing to be aware of is that sometimes we don't want lens flares. So the way to block that, and like here's like a really cool example. It's just like working on set. So this is from behind the scenes, and you could see that this is where the camera is. Let me see if I can't get this a little bigger. So this is where the camera is here. It's pointing this direction. You can kind of see in the monitor here, it's like pointing off this direction. And then we also have this light source here, and there's another light source coming from this direction, and that's hitting the lens. But you can see our gaffer here setting up a flag. And if you watch, you can see that as he moves the flag to the edge, you see that? Just as he just was bringing the flag. So if you look here, this is called Video Village. It's like an area like where you set up like a live feed so the director and the team can watch. This is like Amy Enser, our editor here. And so as the flag comes into the shot, it blocks just like that edge of the frame and gets rid of that flare on the side. So that's an important thing to be aware. Like oftentimes you use a matte box, or you have like a hood on the lens sometimes, and those are to get rid of the flare that's coming in from the side. And sometimes you could just, just move your hand in and just hold your hand there and block light coming from the edge of the lens to create this kind of glaring and flares and stuff like that. And so that's how you would get rid of that if you wanted to get rid of it. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because if you had a really bright light in the corner of your screen or corner of your shot, it's going to create these kind of like flares. So just something to be aware of, like as you're compositing, that's going to add to your shot and the believability of your shot. And you can see like as he's fiddling with the flag, that flare is kind of like coming and going, which is like really interesting to see that happen in real time.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting that you mentioned, like just using your hand. Like in photography, like, I mean, this is what lens hoods, are like, are for. And really helping out with that. Like in my office, it's kind of funny. I keep referring to it because I do a lot of the things that you talk about in here. But in my office, that's actually like why my monitor, if you notice, like my monitor is cutting partially into frame. I mean, like not only does it make sense for me to be looking over here at something, but if I took that away, like I would have a huge lens flare that's coming from the rim light behind me. And so I kind of got okay with leaving it in frame. So yeah, you can pretty much use anything. I've used paper plates before, cutouts of cardboard boxes. Yeah, just random stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, and like again, like just to underscore it, those things like your hand and paper plates, like they don't have to be in frame. So like if this is the lens, they don't have to be in front of the lens. It's just kind of like right above the lens is enough sometimes to block the light that's coming in and all the flaring that's happening. So
yep.
Just be aware of that. And then another, just like a little tip, that wide angle lenses are more prone to glare and flare-ups than long lenses. So before I talked about using a vintage lens with non-anti-reflective coating on it, and a zoom lens, so there's more lens components, and a wide angle lens will get you more, they tend to flare up more than longer lenses. So, and also too, that goes as well with glare. So if you're using a super wide lens in your scene, then to add that realism, you might want to add some glare. And it's really interesting, especially like next week, we'll talk about focal length and stuff like that. And a lot of these things, a lot of that information might be new to you, but we're so used to the visual language of film that we feel it. Like that might be new. This right here might be new information to you, that wide angle lenses are more prone to glare than long lenses. And you might look at a shot and be like, I can't tell if that's wide or long. I don't even know what wide and long are. But you're so used to seeing wide lenses and long lenses that like inherently we just kind of sense a lot of this stuff. So a lot of times, like when you're first starting out, you look at a render and it's just like, I can't tell why this is wrong. On paper, I'm doing everything right. My lights line up, everything seems to be right. But if you don't understand focal length and you don't understand the behavior of lenses, then you can't actually uh, really accurately recreate photorealism, because photorealism is realism through the lens of photography, the lens of cinematography. That's how we're used to seeing photorealism. So a big part of photorealism is understanding optics, how glass works and how these things behave, so that we could then recreate that language across, different media or whatever. If we change our focal length, our scene composition, then the behaviors of light in our scene need to reflect that. And if you don't
Amen.
understand this stuff, sometimes the software doesn't help you. Anyways, good. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying amen. We get an amen
Oh,
in here.
thanks, man. That's fine. Oh, here's an example where like this is like a behind the scenes shot where like I'm auditioning a flag. Like, okay, let's see. And oftentimes what I'll do when I'm on set is I will kind of like move my hand like that over my lens, just kind of like auditioning to see if the flare is there. 'Cause sometimes you get like a little bit of flare on the edges of frame and you can't always tell. So just kind of like waving your hand right around the edge of the lens can help you to see, like, if a flare goes away, it's like, oh, there is flare coming in, and I didn't recognize that. But then when you get into color grading, it's like really, really obvious. I mean, we're kind of like doing like a run and gun shoot. It was like below freezing temperatures. Like we're trying to just like hurry through the day. We have a child actor. There's all these like things on set that are going on that can affect like the stress and the monitoring, the ability to see stuff. And then when you get in post, it's like, oh wait, we got to have like a little bit of flare going on the right hand side. It makes it a lot harder to color grade. That's another thing about fog, is it adds a lot of pain and annoyance to to color grading. Okay, let's switch gears. We're gonna go back to After Effects, and I was gonna talk about flares and magic bullet looks, but there are flares and magic bullet looks, and just be aware of that. I won't talk about it here, but you could also set up kind of like flagging on the edges in the flares and magic bullet looks. So as you start learning about cinematography and real world things like cookies or fog or whatever, or these flares or the edge of frame, that's where the flares came from, whatever it is, you start seeing this stuff all over the place, whether it's in particular or real lens flares or magic bullet looks. It just really helps your whole game and all the tools that you use. Now, we're going to talk about bokeh. We're going to switch gears, talk about bokeh, which I think is really the magic of what's going on. We're doing good on time. So we're going to start here in After Effects, because After Effects has like a lot more limited tools than Cinema and Redshift. And so I find that the cinematography vocabulary of After Effects users is typically more limited than that of Cinema and Redshift users, because if you're going to make a photorealistic scene, like at some point you're going to, watch a Maxon webinar or whatever you're doing, like to learn about cinematography, because it's just so much more natural to that environment to, learn about photoreal stuff. But After Effects, you can kind of get by without really knowing what any of this stuff does. So I want to show you that you could actually do this stuff here in After Effects. So we're going to talk about bokeh. And bokeh is, if you're not familiar, bokeh is kind of like a made-up word, and it's basically like the light blossoms. When you see like a little bit of light and then it's out of focus in the background, the camera lens tends to make those little lights bloom and blossom and grow. and not just kind of like shrink. So if you're using like Gaussian blur and you're in like 8 bits per channel mode in After Effects and you blur it, then it tends to shrink those things. Those things shrink. But in real world cameras, if it's a piece of light, it will look to bloom, and it creates these like really gorgeous artifacts in the lens. The way that it bounces, it's just so sparkly and magical and amazing. So we're always looking for bokeh, and when you're trying to get bokeh in a digital app, it can be really challenging, especially if you're not familiar with cinematography. So that was a big part of why I wanted to do this, this whole thing this month. So one of the things that you need to do first and foremost, if you want to get bokeh, is that you have to open the aperture. So like when we were making our beautiful shot here, let's see, did we? Yeah. Okay. So when you're making our beautiful shot, we had this initially with the scene, because it's just like Christmas lights, just like regular Christmas lights behind her. And so like, they're kind of out of focus, but we need to create some more separation so we can create more out of focus. And we also need to be able to darken the scene, so that way we can open our aperture more to compensate. And then when we open our aperture, actually, I think you can see this. So we gave some space, backed up, and then pulled her away from it. And then you could see in camera, as we're opening the aperture, what that's doing to the bokeh. So I'm gonna go frame by frame here. So we made it darker, less light, and then, so this is what the bokeh looks like normally, which is cool. But then as we open up the aperture, you can see what's going on here. It's increasing the size of the bokeh and the beauty of the bokeh. So that's the first thing you want to do, is you want to open up the aperture. And After Effects, this is not always a very clear thing. So like if I wanted to like okay, let me turn on depth of field, let's say. Actually, I'll take this down to like, I turn on depth of field of my camera. I got some Trapcode Particular particles here, and nothing's happening. Got my depth of field on. I fiddle with my focus distance, my zoom. What's going on? How come I can't get these, these particles to be sparkly and gorgeous like bokeh? How can I get that? And once you understand how optics work, there's an aperture value here. So just like we saw with Kelsey, the model just a second ago, where we have Christmas lights, we open up the aperture and those bloom. Same thing in After Effects. We go to the aperture, we increase the aperture, and we start seeing the same thing. We're getting more blur. And look at, there's even some stuff in the background. Oh wait, no, I'm just like seeing things. That's not right. That's not right. I'm seeing like flashes, like lights. Like when you stare at like a pattern for like a long time, you start seeing it everywhere. Like on the
Oh
box
yeah.
of the arms, you start seeing like these optical illusions. That's what I was like seeing, and I was like, wow, it's bringing stuff out of the background. So as I increase this, we start to see these blossom and bloom. And just like we talked about the first week, when you open up the aperture, you make the depth of field more shallow. So if you just want to focus on one little specific particle and that's in focus and everything else is blurry, you got to bump up the aperture more. And this is not an absolute value, and I don't understand how like 224 pixels relates to the aperture. And sometimes a little tiny amount of aperture makes a huge difference, and sometimes you need a huge amount of aperture to make any difference at all. So you really got to play with this, but that's how you create a shallow depth of field in After Effects, is by opening up the aperture. And all these programs have different ways to kind of express these same type things. And if you don't understand like real world cameras, like sometimes there'll be like a depth of field slider, but that's rare. Typically you have to know a little bit about cameras in order to make that work. So that's how you create great sparkles. Another thing about bokeh is that oftentimes, let's see, if I go back to Premiere here, my example, oftentimes, these actually aren't perfect circles. We can look at this and say like, yeah, it's circular, but it's not really a perfect circle. And not only is like shape-wise not a perfect circle, if I zoom in, pardon me, Kelsey, if we zoom in really closely, we can kind of see that there are these little like abnormalities, these like organic abnormalities. Not only we have a little like bright ring on the outside, but we also have these little like kind of speckles as it goes through the lens elements, the optical elements. And this is the kind of like organic stuff that we're used to seeing. So when you look at in After Effects, you see these like circles and they're blurry or whatever. It's like, something in your heart is telling you like that's not quite right. That's better. It's cool. It's going in the right direction, but something is not quite right with that. I mean, we have like the add blend mode going on. So these add together in the same way that we're seeing here with the sprites, they add together just like that. So, Particular gives you that function, but still somehow it's not quite right. And if you were to even change like the aspect ratio and create some like randomness with that, it might help, but it's not going to get you quite there because, really it's a different object. It's because it's using this organic thing. So be aware, Particular, you can go into sprites, click on choose sprite, and awesomely, there is a bokeh area where there's actual sampled bokeh. So like you actually use this with like the highlight fringes and all these different shapes from an organic camera lens, click OK. And then we have like actual bokeh. So then we could go colorize this and brighten it and use the add mode or whatever we're doing to brighten this up and create more organic bokeh that way. Another thing, and oh wait, should we? Okay, we'll come back to that. Okay. One of the things that you can do, and this is like a teaser for next week. One of the things that you could do to get more bokeh is to use a longer lens. And again, it's a teaser for next week because we're going to like next week is going to be mostly talking about focal length of lenses. So when you see like, a 35 millimeter lens versus like a 100 millimeter lens, and to me, I think this is going to be like if that doesn't make sense to you, if you're kind of like, I don't understand 35 versus 100, I don't understand what that would mean or what that would do to my image, that next week will be really, really helpful for you. I think like for me, like this is the thing that inspired, like that was the impetus behind this whole month of training, is that like we've got to get to focal length, got to talk about focal length because that's going to make a huge difference in your visual storytelling. Like you'll probably never think of a shot the same way after really understanding focal length. But just as a teaser for that, lenses have a focal length. It's basically kind of like their field of view, but it's more than that. They just have different optical properties. And again, I don't want to spoil next week by talking about it this week, but here I have the default. This is the default focal length in Cinema 4D, and we're going to get into Cinema 4D in just a second and look at focal length there as well. I was at Camp MoGraph, and I felt really bad for being sick last week, so I was like, I took one of my activity days on Camp MoGraph, and I was just like, got to make a better week for the demystifying people. They're so patient with me, and it's got to deliver, make up for being sick. And so I spent a bunch of time on one of my activity days, just like making out this example and in cinema to make it clear what focal length is really doing. But typically, the lower that you get when you're working with lenses in millimeters. So if you're like at a 15 millimeter, like that's really wide, and it's a really wide field of view. And so it's great for like if you have like a landscape or something like that, and you want to see like everything. So and typically like if you use your cell phone camera, at least iPhones at least have a fairly wide focal length, because if you're having your little phone right here and you want to get a photo and you're like at a club or something like that and you're like want to get a selfie, or like you want to be able to capture like more data, so they make that lens fairly wide. So as I talk about like wide lenses, getting flares and all that kind of stuff, you can kind of like apply that to your cell phone if you ever shoot footage with your cell phone. But there's also longer lenses, and as you get higher in like in that value of like millimeters, then we get a longer lens, and that's kind of like, think of like portraits. If you want to like zoom into something, you would use a longer lens. But the optical properties of wide lenses versus long lenses, also long lenses are often called telephoto lenses, but the difference between wide and long lenses changes everything in a scene. The way that everything is seen between wide and long lenses changes the relationship of objects to each other. So if you're into design and composition and like putting stuff in the frame, like focal length, when we talk about it next week, it changes the whole story. There's optical tricks, all kinds of things. And also what it does is it will change bokeh. So like right now in a typical like wide lens, let's say there's a 36 millimeter lens, and we have these little things in the background, and they're tiny and not very, if our sparkles were all the way back here, they wouldn't be very grand and beautiful. So if you use a longer lens, it brings stuff in the background to the foreground, or I should say it takes those things and makes them bigger. So that's how we were able to get this result with little baby Christmas lights.
Can
So
I interject a
please,
little bit?
please,
So
please.
in photography, what we're talking about is compression. And so when I've explained this to students in the past, it's like taking a sandwich, and I know this sounds really weird,
Do it. I love it.
but it's like imagine the lens, right, and the glass, and the longer you go with the lens, it's like taking that sandwich and it's like smushing it together. So you have your foreground, your midground, and or I'd say your foreground, your subject, and then your background. And the longer you go in focal length, the more you're compressing that sandwich, and that's when you get like really milky bokeh. I like to call it milky bokeh. I don't know what the if there's an actual term for that, because it gets to a point where it's almost like not even bokeh anymore. Like you don't see the little dots. Like it's just silky smooth. Once you get to like say certain 85 mil lenses to 135, 200, if you have your subject closer to the camera, that background is going to be completely smooth and buttery. Yep. It's like a garlic bread sandwich.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks, man. I appreciate that. I love that you have like a love of bokeh. I mean, it's kind of hard not to love bokeh. I mean, like I can't imagine meeting somebody and just like folding arms like, no, I don't like bokeh. I don't know.
I
Like,
mean, it's tough. And like as a digital artist, so like as a composite photographer, I really struggle to not do that. So like even when I'm shooting in studio, like it's really cool to have like the depth of field, like kind of blurring out the hair and this and that, and it does not work very well when you have to put the work in post to to key that or extract it. For me, I shoot on a gray backdrop instead of green or blue, so it's a little bit different. It's a more of an extraction process rather than keying, but bokeh and keying does not work
yeah.
as good as you would wish it does. So that's another thing to pay attention to, but that's a whole different visual effects. We might have to bring Hashi on to talk about that sometime.
But I mean, like, that is like a really good point though, is that like, like for you, even though you do a lot of like real world camera shooting, like that's actually, like you're probably doing a lot of your bokeh in post because on set it's like really, really difficult to do. So for you, I'm
Yeah.
guessing knowing all these things is like really helpful because you use it all the time, even though
Yeah,
you
and
do
so
shoot live.
Yeah, and so it what's interesting about it is that like just to pay attention to some of this stuff, like thinking about compression and like kind of squishing the sandwich and different things. If you do searches or just kind of pay attention when you're out, whether it's cinematography or photography itself, pay attention to say like nature photos versus sports photography. So a lot of sports photography are shot on super long lenses, to be able to get in close to the action. And what you'll notice is that that player, that subject, will be in focus, and within maybe a couple feet of that person, like you start to get a really nice transition into, a good depth of field. And that's because they're using that compression. The longer that they go with that lens, the more they're really able to kind of eliminate all of the distraction around the subject and just focus in. So, yeah.
Very cool. Just really quickly, again, this is kind of like a teaser for next week, but also helping with the bokeh conversation. It's like I really hope if you don't know the focal length thing, I just really, really encourage you to check out next week's thing because that's like where the rubber meets the road. But a lot of people that are new in cinema that don't have a cinematography background, they, like I have a cube here and I have a camera. Let's look through the camera. And just like default scene, I have like focal length. And so you go to focal length here and you slide it. Okay, it's like just like zoom, it's just like moving the camera in and out. But if I go outside of my camera and I look at this camera on this cube and I adjust my focal length, it is not zooming in and out. It is changing what the way that the camera is seeing the thing, and the camera is not moving at all. And I set up this example. This is what I did at Camp MoGraph. I used 3 different colors here. So I have a wide lens, which is in the red here, and then the yellow camera, which is the default settings of cinema. So this is just like the default camera, and then a longer lens in the green. Now, I just had a simple scene with like a cube with like a cloner, you know, just simple thing. And I use that so that we can have a clear view. I wanted to create like the perfect example. So I worked really hard on this. So like, you know, if you see a cube of clones and you have a wide angle lens, and let's say you make it wider. Well, it's going to push that stuff away. So then what you can do is reframe the objects so that they have the same composition, or that at least the objects closest to camera are in the same spot. And that is how to tell what lenses are actually doing. So again, just as the teaser for next week, this is a 36 mm. I'm going to go ahead and my filter. I'm going to look at the geometry only, just so we see this. So this is the default settings for the Cinema 4D camera. This is what those cubes look like at that angle. So if I get a wider lens, it's going to, again, push me back. So then if I zoom in to get the same framing, this is what that's like. This is what that does. So this is with a 36 mm camera. This is with a 15 mm camera. Notice the cubes closest to camera and their shape. Notice how they distort. They're no longer perfect cubes. Of course, the cubes themselves are not affected at all, but the way that we see them through the camera is completely revolutionized. Where they are in the frame, our composition, our framing, everything changes, even the shapes of the objects. So here's the default camera. There's the wide, going back to default, and a longer lens does this. So you can see how if we had bokeh at our default lens and we don't know how to use cameras, we don't know about this optics with the bokeh, we can have these little tiny bokeh and we just want to be bigger, but we don't want to move them, yada, yada. So we use a longer lens and it smushes the sandwich and it brings the stuff closer to frame. So we'll talk about that next week. There's a lot more to the story and a lot of really cool tricks that you can do with that changes your framing and the way that you see everything. So strongly recommend doing that. Another thing to be aware of, and Dustin touched on this a little bit, but when we're dealing with, so here's this shot outdoors. As we mentioned, in order to get bokeh, you have to open the aperture. So if you're outdoors during the day, it's really difficult to get a shallow depth of field, let alone bokeh, because you're having to, in order to get bokeh and shallow depth of field, you have to open up the aperture, but it's already super, super, super bright. So one of the things you can do is use ND filters, neutral density filters on the lens, which will like darken it automatically. And that basically like loses exposure. And so then when it's darker, then you could open up the aperture, which allows you to get a shallower depth of field. Another way, this is like a hack. I don't hear people talking about this very often, so I don't know if it's like bad to do this or if people talk about it and I just don't hear it or whatever. But I also use a longer lens because again, you're going to bring things closer to you with a longer lens. So in this shot outdoors, like this preacher guy was really far away from the background in the trees. So I think this was like a 200 millimeter lens, 400 millimeter lens. I mean, a really, really long lens, but I was stopped down to 11.3, which is really, really tiny. But I'm still able to get this apparent shallow depth of field because of the separation of the subject from the background combined with a very, very long lens. So it takes those like kind of slightly blurry elements and sandwiches them together so much that you can create this look. And if anytime you watch like a TV show or something like that, if there's like a a really gorgeous shallow depth of field shot like this, it's usually done on a very, 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 very long lens. You can see that there's trees way in the background and then like they're compressed like this. So if you, again, taking it back to digital cinematography, if you have a scene that's like during the daytime and it's a wide lens and objects are like not squished, and you have bokeh, that scene is going to feel weird. It's going to feel off and wrong. And because like that's not what we're used to seeing. That's not, again, the visual vocabulary that we've established with cinematography. It's going to be broken. It's not going to feel right ever because that's not how optics work. So again, something to be aware of. Okay, last thing I wanted to get to today. I know that we're at time, but I want to talk about aperture science business. The technical stuff is kind of a challenge, but understanding the language of how the aperture works and even just kind of like knowing some of that stuff, I find it to be like really, really helpful. So I'm going to get into some of this, and Dustin, obviously, feel free to jump in. But we measure the openness of the aperture with the unit of measurement called f-stops. So, and it's like really weird. You see like f/1.8. So that's a f-stop of 1.8. See like f2, that's an f-stop of 2. And the way they move is in increments called f-stops, and describes the openness of the lens. And f stands for fraction, which is why if you open the aperture, you get a smaller number, and if you close the aperture, you get a bigger number. So it's a little bit confusing and kind of counterintuitive, but let's talk about why that is. I think that that really helps to understand what's going in. So the way that that F is calculated is by taking the focal length of the lens in millimeters divided by the openness of the aperture in millimeters. Now, if you're like me and you hate math, and a number divided by another number melts your brain down and you can't comprehend it, then you're in a safe space, because I'm the same way. So just as an example, if you have a 100mm lens, I'm using like very simple like things here, so you don't do like that much math, especially from the West Coast and it's like 9 in the morning. You have a 100mm lens divided by, let's say the aperture is open at 25mm. Then the f-stop would be f4. 100mm lens divided by 25mm opening, it's at f4. And the reason why the aperture gets tinier at bigger things is because like we're dividing the pizza into more slices. So a 100mm lens opened up to 50mm, like 100 divided by 50 gets you a tinier result. So it's f2. So again, we're opening up the aperture, or opening up the aperture, it's going to get a smaller f-stop number. Shrinking the aperture, it's going to get a larger number.
And
Now,
so the
oh,
scale, the scale of the opening that we deal with is also reflected in cost for quite a few of these lenses.
yeah,
So when
yeah,
just to make sense as to why certain lenses are more expensive, it all depends on the glass and the cost that it, for the the yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Anyways.
Typically, too, I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot more than this. You can't just
Yeah.
like look at like lens prices and be like, oh wait, this price is, this only opens up to like f8. They lied to me. It's really expensive. There's a lot of different reasons why lenses are expensive, but yeah, typically it's like the aperture. Like if you're like zoom lenses, I mentioned, it's really hard to get like fast zoom lenses because it's just, you have all those optics. It's kind of like a miracle being able to like flip all that glass and to be able to like zoom, like especially in real time. So to be able to make it so that you could open up the aperture really wide on those zoom lenses, all that complexity, it's very, very expensive. So if you find a fast zoom lens, you're going to be paying for it. It's going to be expensive.
Yeah, so of course, there's quite a bit that goes into that on the back end, but it's definitely one of those. If you find a 100mm lens, that's able to say f2, is able to get cut that way. Yeah, you're going to be paying. It's all on brand and mechanics and quite a bit more science, but definitely.
Yeah, and those are hypothetical values, by the way. I don't know if I don't have a 100mm that can open up to f2. That'd be nice though. But the way that they're calculated. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I'm agreeing with you. I think there's a little bit of lag between the two of us.
Okay, sorry. Um, yeah, but I know it's like deflating, like somebody like talks over something you said. So like I want to hear everything you're saying. It's like amazing. So like even though there's a lag, like please interject. It's amazing. Um, but this is like the last thing for the day. But the way that this is calculated is kind of like interesting. And again, this helped me understand this, and may help somebody else. But Typically, the way that they calculate f-stops is by doubling the previous value. So I don't know where f1.4 and f2 come from, but like let's say these are the starting points. The next f-stop up, it would be, we'd arrive at that by doubling the f1.4, and so then we would get f2.8. And then the next f-stop we would double the f2 to get f4. And then if we want to go to the next f-stop, then we double the 2.8 to 5.6, and so on and so forth. And that's how we arrive generally at like f-stops. And of course, there's incremental f-stops, like I mentioned, f1.8. But because these are like division equations, like you typically don't see like an f like 2.9 or an f 1.9 or 2.1 or whatever. So like there are kind of like middle increments in between this, again, like 1.8 or like a 2.2 or whatever. But typically this is like the major f-stops, the increments that you see over and over again, and this is how they are calculated. So hopefully that makes things clear. Again, next week we're going to be talking about focal length. If this is new to you, please check that out, because the focal length stuff is like, for telling stories. I got some cool examples, and also we're gonna talk about rain. Lighting rain is like really interesting. We haven't talked about that yet, so I'm gonna add that into the thing, and we'll talk about how to make the beautiful shot thing that we've been seeing. We'll go from scratch on that so that it makes sense how to go from this to something gorgeous, and we'll see that it's all the same concepts we've been talking about all month long. So that's that. And also too, like I want to go into cinema, or have Dustin actually go into cinema and Redshift and show us how to get a shallow depth of field with these tools as well, because as we saw in After Effects, it's kind of like it's not always expected what the deal is, and being able to use those tools and be able to manipulate them to get shallow depth of field is really helpful and useful, of course. So Dustin, you cool with that next week? Showing us
Yeah.
all the pressure of everybody watching, pressuring you. I'm bullying you into like doing this by using public shame as my weapon of.
Yeah, I don't mind. I think that'll be fun. We can maybe talk a little bit, on how to do it technically, um, if it's needed. But we can also discuss maybe the ways that I do it, set it up a bit more creative while still staying in the confines of, maybe not using like an aperture of 0.5 or something
Yeah.
crazy. But we could talk about how I do these things a little bit differently. And yeah, I don't think we'll actually have time to talk about how to do this stuff in post, so we'll save that for another month or another series. But that would definitely be fun to get into, using our tools that we have in 3D. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I love when you like your examples today with the I guess probably I should say this for offline, but I love that example with the gobo and stuff like that, and using light, and like you explained it so well with the environment in Redshift, and like took everything that I was saying about fog and everything that we saw, I just like transferred it so perfectly that it made it very, very clear to me, especially like it made it very clear about the environment and how that's set up, and all that business. So fantastic. I mean, the ability that we have now to like recreate real world optics and real world scenes and realism. And even if you're not doing realism, if you're doing stylized stuff, it still pays to understand like the way that we see images. And when we were talking about fog and all that stuff, it's really like we're learning about light in that process. It's not just kind of like, oh, this is what fog does. It's like this is also how light behaves. And so like then as you're playing around with something even like super stylized, I think it's gonna help. So
Yeah, I mean, and that's just the basics. We didn't even talk about like noise, fog, and all of that stuff. That's a whole different. Yeah, we could do a whole series just on volumetrics and lighting that in cinematic environments.
yeah.
Ellie has a couple cool videos on that on the Maxon training team's channel. So if you're curious,
Yes. She
check those
did,
out.
just like on our way out, she did, you have to search for the Maxon training team YouTube, but earlier this year in February, She did a hands-on with Redshift series where I think it was like 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks of just like all the different things. I think it was 4 weeks on Redshift. And one of the weeks she talked about using the environment and like all that kind of stuff. And she like dug deep into a lot of this stuff. But yeah, I agree with you, man. I think that we should have like a month just like on Redshift cinematography and taking these same tools, but just like digging deeper and maybe not even digging deeper as much as just like practicing using these things and using these techniques and stuff like that, like in Redshift. So I think that'd be cool.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everybody so
We
much
got
for watching today. Dustin, thanks again for your amazing examples and just for being here and the concept, like the comments that you made and your contributions like that. Just really fantastic. And I really love the series. I can't wait for next week. Thanks everyone for being here because like if no one showed up, we wouldn't do this. So like you're making this happen. We really, really appreciate it. And just like love you. Very dear to our hearts
okay.
to be able to like connect with y'all every week and stuff. So
We have
um,
a question.
oh,
We have a couple questions in chat before
okay.
we get off here.
Sweet.
Let's see. So Jake is or Jake. Yeah, hold on, Jake. We'll just double that from your first comment earlier. I think he messed up both of our names. So back at you, buddy. So Drake is saying,
Hey.
"Wait, my question." So we go up a little bit here. Uh, Magic Bullet looks.
Yes.
Whenever I try to use any subtools, like lens vignette or edge softness, I don't know how to rotate the angle. Um, yeah, so far, let's see, he's
Mm.
stuck adjusting the width and the height weirdly in most of his scenes. So
Hmm.
how do you get those effects at an angle if you're wanting to adjust?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I honestly like haven't played that much with these. I've used them like a few times, but yeah, I don't think I know how to play with that at an angle.
I
Like
feel like
typically,
Vin
go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like vignette, like whenever I've done that on anything, especially like live action based, like I've always, if I've had a need for it, having vignette at an angle, things of that nature is like a little bit, um, I guess it would almost never be at an angle if that
Yeah.
makes sense. So usually it
Hmm.
would just be as it is in frame. But if I've ever, creatively kind of placed vignettes, if that sounds okay, I guess it sounds really weird because generally you wouldn't normally do it. But I would grab something like a black solid and like manually adjust a mask or a path around where I need that to be. And then just rotate that um, but the edge softness and the vignette are definitely something that's like inherent to that lens. So
Hmm.
I wouldn't necessarily see myself adjusting that like on its own at an angle.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why is that like, the purpose of Magic Bullet looks is to kind of like enhance what's there in the camera. And so, it says haze flare, but on set we use flare in like just in universal terms, whereas post that means two different things. In other words, like if I get a little bit of like light spilling in on the edge of frame, I would say it's flaring. So that's technically a lens flare. But then in post production, when you say lens flare, it just means with all the pretty sparkle thingies happening to it. So I think that like they're using flare here as it would like on set, where like any kind of light coming in from the camera. So it's not something that you would art direct because you're not, in the real world, like the haze coming in from the camera on the edge would just kind of like blossom the light that's already there. And
Right.
it wouldn't something that would come in at an angle or whatever. It would blossom in this like horizontal way. So it doesn't have the control intentionally, doesn't have the controls that you would find in like a lens flare plugin where you could spin it and rotate it and do all these things that are unnatural, because that's like typically like it only works in this kind of like normal lensy way here in Magic Bullet Look. So um, yeah, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. Bonus points,
Yeah,
Drake.
so so we let's see. Just an FYI, the digital cinematography folder on Dropbox is empty. So if we have any files that we can upload there, I can send the example file that I have, but that won't really have the textures included currently. Um, but if you just want to, create quick textures in Photoshop or anything like that and throw that in, I can include that.
Yeah, I could also, I mean, I maybe it's just because like I'm all like this, typical artist. It's just like nothing is good that I ever do. And so I just assume that like no one wants to see like these aperture examples or whatever. The depth of field example might be helpful to post, but I'm assuming that when people are like, give us the exercise files, the project files, you're talking about Dustin's Redshift stuff because that's sexy and it looks like really good and stuff like that. And there's like more detail and beauty to it. But if there's something that I'm making in After Effects, like just specifically ask in the chat and like we'll send it along. It's like nothing like earth shattering or nothing I couldn't send along or whatever. So yeah, so just like ask us specifically this week, next week, whatever, we could post stuff there. But I haven't been posting it there because I've just been having like examples from like, Premiere and stuff like that from my LinkedIn learning courses. Cool.
So
Thanks,
the
Drake.
last thing before we head out here, let's see. I believe, okay, there's two of them. So how do you clean the t-shirt, please? It doesn't really work. So I'm assuming it's the link. We had a comment earlier that there was an extra space, I believe, in the link or similar. I'd have to find that. I feel like that's quite a ways up.
Mm.
Link on the PDF to the stores. Let's see, still has an extra space in it, causing the URL not to go to the passcode.
Oh
So
yeah. Yeah, somebody made the latest version of the PDF. They put an extra space in there. So you might have to like copy and paste the URL and then manually go in and take out the space. We got to fix that. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, good catch. And thank you for bringing that up. And good
yeah,
job claiming your free t-shirt. That's good on you for doing that.
let's see. Does the movie camera setting in Cinema 4D have influence on the Redshift camera, or is it when using the physical run? Okay, uh, Zach. Well, let's save that for next week. I am just going to screenshot this question a moment so I can save that, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about that once we get to next week talking about focal length, and then I can probably pop into Redshift and discuss that when we go over the bokeh adjustments.
Yeah, because I'm really curious and I want to see a little bit more detail about like getting shallow depth of field and like all that kind of
Right.
stuff in Redshift and Cinema. And I know everyone else is excited to see that stuff too. So it's really hard, like kind of separating this stuff out because when you're talking about like, the aperture, like in the week one, how do you not talk about like bokeh and depth of field and, and then how do you not mention focal length in that conversation as well? So like these things all kind of like work together. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's like talking about different lines of Voltron and not mentioning Voltron, it's a challenge. Kind of all goes
I
together. It's
mean,
like one big thing.
like, this could, when we're talking like even just cinematography, whether it's digital or not, when we're talking about like this could be an entire like semester course,
Yeah, for sure.
that we're multiple weeks that we talk about this. So
Mhm.
it is difficult to make sure we stick within, I'll just call it an hour and a half timeline every week.
An hour plus. And that plus just frees us from shame for going over. And just an hour plus, whatever that plus ends up being, whatever our hearts dictate for that plus. Well, thanks, Dustin, for being here. Thanks to all of you for being here and sticking around for the plus as well. And we look forward to seeing you next week and taking this puppy home. Ellie will be back with us next week, and it'll be great. And yeah, have a great week. Fantastic, a phenomenal week. And we'll see y'all next Monday.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Have a good one, everybody.
See you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.